Welcome to Santa Barbara Talks with Josh Molina, part two of my extended series with Santa Barbara County First District Supervisor Doss Williams as we talk about his career in office. And we're going to talk about the assembly years today, mostly a little bit of county, but mostly his 6 years in the assembly. But first, Doss, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're back. Nice to see you. Let's start off with what happened this week at the County Board of Supervisors. It was your last meeting. You got to say some final thoughts. The other supervisors were able to talk about you. Steve Lavanino was pretty impressive in terms of his heartfelt comments about your relationship. And a lot of people got to talk. How are you feeling today and after Tuesday, knowing that that was your last meeting?
I'm feeling like $1,000,000, man.
Yeah.
I mean, that was humbling, but it was also just incredible to feel the emotion of your friends and your allies and your colleagues, the people that you, in this case, that I've worked with, and that'll be hard to not be working with, because I really like making a difference with them. And of course, just getting a chance to pay tribute to the voters too, because that none of this would have happened without the trust that voters gave me 11 times, and it's an honor. And the fact that they chose otherwise 2 times doesn't diminish the 11 times for me.
Yeah.
That's an honor. It's a sacred responsibility. And, I, to this day, have a hard time, especially as I'm older, looking at the picture of what I looked like when I was 27 and first ran. You were right about that. Didn't take office till I was 29, but I started running when I was 27. And, I look at that picture, I'm like, I can't believe people gave me their trust. And it's, to me, it's a real honor, and I hope that I've done enough good with it.
Well, that's my problem. I still see you as that person.
Thanks. Yeah.
Um,
Well, in a lot of ways, I am.
you're going to about to be again, now that
I,
you're
I I hope I've learned some things, but I definitely in the last 9 months have felt the fire more, because when you have a limited time to finish some of the projects, like I've felt that fire that I had when I was first council member and wanted to like do everything you can do, and I've got to re-experience that the last 9 months.
Yeah, it was at that meeting. I was, there taking pictures. I'm going to write a story, about it as well. Were you kind of in slow motion? Like, is everything a little bit slower? You trying to absorb it, take it all in? What was your sort of mindset as you're just experiencing this for the final time, this time? Like, what's going through your head?
Well, I think you're right about that. When you're in extreme danger, which I have been before, physically, and when you are experiencing wonder, time seems to slow down, right? And yeah, I think that's is like some sort of survival mechanism in human consciousness, and it seems to slow down. So you seem to be able to react faster if you're in danger, or, as in this case, experience fully the joy of the love of your friends and colleagues. And I mean, I was so touched by their words and the work that we've done together. It's a pretty special thing to do, to work with someone to make the world a little better.
Yeah. So let's talk about the assembly years. And now, so when we left off in part one, we're talking about city council. So at some point, you make a decision that you want to run for something else. Of course, you did have an initial bid for supervisor. That was unsuccessful. You stayed on the council. Talk to me about how you decided to do the assembly, and And why was that an attractive option for you? What was your mindset about working in state government?
Well, it's always something that had made me think I could make a difference at that level. One of the things we may not have gone over last time is I worked for several years for the state legislature, both doing elections for the state Democratic caucus and doing legislative work in Sacramento for Jack Scott, who's now was an assembly member and then a state senator, and then Hannah Beth Jackson in her district office here in town. And so I was familiar with that. Uh, I didn't leave that work because I thought that it was unhelpful. I left for other reasons. And so running for state assembly in some ways was going back to doing some work that I had done before, except before I was a staffer and being an assembly member, you're the legislator. And in many ways, it was my second choice of how to make a difference that way. When you're a campaign person, especially from a working class background like my own, you're not the person that they choose to be a policy, expert, right? Uh, and if you had asked me when I was a young person what would be the job that I would want most, I would want to be the committee consultant for the Natural Resources Committee, right? The one making the caucus recommendations through their chair and on environmental matters. So that did not happen. I didn't, at least when I was working for the legislature, I didn't have that big graduate degree. I didn't have a law degree. I didn't come from elite school and have elite contacts. I was not the kind of person that normally gets that job. So I knew I needed to run to be able to make a policy difference like that. And fortunately, we came up with the most amazing team. The two that I want to mention, of course, is Darcel Elliott, who I met back in 2008. She still works for me now. I just heard her at the phone bank that I was in charge of for Hannah Beth Jackson, and her ability to connect with voters. She was fresh out of college working at Albertsons, but she just was smart, together, and just had an ability to connect with people. And I knew immediately, I want to work. I want to stand shoulder to shoulder in battle with this person because she's committed. And then my old buddy Pat Dennis, who I worked to defeat the recall against Gail Marshall with, and he was willing to come back in town. He slept on my couch to be my campaign manager for the assembly race. And so, like this is a sign of a team that's ready to win, as one that's pouring everything into it. And they did, and I did. And we were the underdog in that race, but we prevailed. And it's a bewildering experience to be an assembly member, and I'm happy to go into that too.
Yeah, let's talk about some of the issues that you focused on. It's so funny because media covers city council to death, board of supervisors, school boards, and then there's this really important layer of government, the legislature, the assembly, and even to some degree state senate. And we don't cover that with the same like vigor daily that we do these local boards. But you're over there making laws, but I think the feeling is, oh, you're off in Sacramento, but as I know well, your schedule is Sacramento during the week, and then you're back in the district on the weekends. So you're torn between these two worlds, but important work. So let's talk about some of the things that you focused on there's higher education, there's energy, climate change, the first red flag law, so much, that you could focus on environmentally, which is where you got your start, right? This is who you are from the beginning. Now you could focus on this from a statewide policy. Talk to me about what you consider your successes.
Well, I'll say obviously the one that's most important to me is Senate Bill 350, um, the uh, uh, the landmark climate change law that I partnered with the Senate Pro Tem on, and it's really like relevant. Most of the investment in renewable energy that's happened in the last decade has come from that bill. It successfully extended the bucket system, which makes sure that most of the renewable power is in state. It created a higher renewable mandate, and because of particularly my work, it also moved the bar on energy efficiency, which is vital to make a clean energy future work. And I found out it was, something that someone, when I went into the legislature, said that if you aren't worried about how much credit you get, you can get a lot done. And this was a quintessential example of that. I was partnering with the Senate Pro Tem, and obviously he wants to be the leader because he's the head honcho. But I also know, because he's got lots of assignments, and this was what I wanted to concentrate on, that the partnership could be, where I get to help write a lot of that bill. So it was a really cool experience. Had great committee consultants because in the last 2 years in the legislature, I was chair of Natural Resources Committee, the committee that I dreamed of being on when I was a young man. And so we were able to do some good. And the weird thing is now, as a supervisor, I've been the county's representative on Central Coast Community Energy, which purchases energy on the local people's behalf. And I've had to deal with the mechanisms that we put into law back in 2015 with Senate Bill 350.
So, what was that like? When you're working with the city council, it's a smaller world. It's still important to get along with your colleagues. How are you able to navigate that so you're working with other individuals to get things done? Is it the stereotype? Is there wheeling and dealing? You've got to be nice, you've got to find compromise. Um, what was that world like for you in the context of getting this bill passed?
Well, it is really important to have good relationships with their colleagues in the legislature to be able to get things done. But it is possible to have good relationships. I'm really pleased to say that I ended up having very few enemies in the legislature, even while getting a lot done. And part of that has to do with I got a reputation for willing to really work my bills, which people respect. Um, that means, like, I was willing to talk to absolutely every single legislator. So that's 119 conversations minimum, because even if you just talk to each of them once, which obviously committee heads, you want to talk to them more than once.
Mhm.
So uh, I and it was also because I spent time to uh, connect with my colleagues. I didn't want to carouse late at night very much, because was newly married and wanted to have my marriage last, and thank I thank God that it has. And I know that legislators have very high divorce rates. So I would make a
Almost as
breakfast.
much as journalists.
Yeah, and firefighters. It's the yeah. Uh, so I I did a breakfast group, and I made cappuccinos on the floor for folks. and I ran a Bible study, and participated first in Bible study and then ran the Bible study. So it was very cool, um, making relationships with people who have represent very different parts of the state, have different priorities. Some of them weren't even Democrats, right? And trying to figure out where the common ground is and how you can work together. And I suppose it was the combination of that and working with the amazing intensity and moral conviction of Governor Brown that emboldened me to be more about to like live to demonstrate that by living the values, I could connect with people who didn't necessarily consider something like climate change to be as much of a priority as I was, as
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
But people respected if you lived it, and you were remained ethically consistent about it. Even a lot of conservatives would respect that and go, okay, all right, I think I might be able to be okay with this.
Yeah. I don't want to go too much on this, because you've talked about it before, but that environmental sensibility that you have, and I think Steve Lavanino mentioned this, and I know that since as far as I've known you, and when I worked in the assembly, people would say things like, "Oh, whatever." They would levy various criticisms of you, right? But I would say to them, when it comes to the environmental stuff, like if he's faking that, he's faking it 24/7 all the time to the point where it might as well be real because you buy used clothes, you have the electric cars, we've gone to Starbucks before and like you won't even order like a cup there, you just get like a cup of water or something. You'll bring your own cup. These kind of things. You didn't learn that growing up with your dad and mom, right? I mean, so where does that come from? Like, is it like, oh, that's a good political path to be on, or you just have this gene of like, I want to not use too much stuff?
No, I mean, even as a kid, it was the thing that was most present in my mind is like, you know, what kind of child race are we humans stumbling around destroying things without realizing it, and what as we as we grow up, and I sure hope we grow up as a race soon, um, what we will look around and go, God, what did we do? And my hope is to play my part in containing the damage, right? And make sure that we have a world that's livable, um, for our kids and our grandkids and other people's kids and grandkids and even other species. Because to me, if there is any kind of um, universal truth that it lies outside of faith, and I'm a person of faith, so I believe in universal truths, but I if there is a universal truth that lies outside of faith, it is that life should exist and continue, and to me, in my mind, that means a lot of different forms of life. So I think that for those reasons, and because climate change is going to create refugee crises that will shake this world, um, we should all be working double time to try to um, improve it. And where I depart maybe from some environmentalists is I think it really has to begin with your own commitment, that you every day buy what you buy and what you don't buy, you vote for what kind of world you want to live in, and that how you vote and how you advocate matters, but also how you act matters just as much, because the things like our dependence on fossil fuel, that's not just created by the PR machine that is the oil industry. It's also created by our own choices. And our choices can, we can make other choices. And that's my hope for the future.
Yeah. I have a doomer who I interview, Elliot Jacobson. Maybe you've seen him on the show, but he says the best thing we can do to save the environment is like stop electric, stop fossil fuels. Like less is more because every time you try to create renewable energy, you're still damaging the planet because we're so far gone, and his attitude is it starts with you eating less, walking less. Everybody needs to do less. And he doesn't even think it's for humans. He thinks it's too late, because we're going to see, as you said, parts of the country world that are so hot. People are going to be migrating to these populations and weather climates where they can for only so long, but it's really about saving the planet for species, not necessarily humans, and he gets a ton of views. He's controversial, but I think there's something to be said for less
Well,
stop.
I definitely agree with him on the idea that a huge part of, and this is borne out by the numbers, a huge amount of our emissions is just how much meat or how much plane flights or how much gas we consume. So, like if you aggregate that, it's more than, what any of the bad corporations are doing.
Yeah.
So, he's right about that. I don't, I don't agree that the statistical meaning the most likely scenario is as doom filled as he says. But anybody who understands statistics knows that there are standard deviations out there, and there are less likely scenarios that we should take into account. And the doom scenario is a less likely but significant scenario that we should be trying our best to avoid. I just am of the belief that every bit that you make the world better is worth it. If one life is saved, if one species is saved, if one continent is saved, if one country is saved, it's it's worth it, right? I think that the reason why evil persists in the world is not because people are all evil. It's because they tell themselves stories about how they can't make a difference. And the narratives of our society tell us stories about how we can't make a difference. So bad stuff continues because we don't try.
This is the DOS I know. Where was this DOS the last 2 years? No, I'm sorry. I'll stop taking my digs. Just kidding.
No, I hear you. You get older, sometimes you get grumpy, but I never stopped believing in that. And you know, but I do think it made a difference in the legislature. I got some very tough bills through. That Senate Bill 350 being just that was a hard one to get through. We had to change it the night before the final vote to get enough votes to get it through, even with Governor Brown pushing it as hard as he could. We we had to make adjustments in the 11th hour. And another, I guess, example is some of the education work I did. I can remember I had to, go into the bathroom and tell someone to go vote who was, going to the bathroom, you know, because it was a razor shit thin margin. And you could only do that when you have a certain relationship with somebody.
That's true. Yeah. Look, so let's talk about some of your other stuff in the assembly. I want to get to redevelopment and the abolition of the RDAs in a second. But what about gun restraining orders, red flag laws. I know you worked on that. Let's talk about your interest in that world and what that was all about.
Well, the the massacre out in Isla Vista in 2014 really put danger to the fore. And here was a clear example of someone who had shown signs of mental health difficulties, being a danger to themselves and and others. And but you know nothing had happened because the ones who recognized it the most were his roommates, and the roommates moved out. But then other roommates came in, and those roommates are the ones he killed. So you know, I contacted an old colleague from Jack Scott's uh, um, office who was working with Nancy Skinner, who was a really energetic senator. And I said, what can we do? And we put our heads together, and another great partnership to create the first red flag law that wasn't just for law enforcement in the country. And I am so humbled by how far this has gone, uh, because it is now in 20 something states, and in California, it's something that a roommate can use, a family member can use, a teacher, coworker, um, and what it does is, you have to, if you are the one who is identifying someone as being a danger to themselves and other, you have to go to the court and make a petition to the court. You can do so, I believe, definitely in California, but I think in any state, by going to uh, speak speakforsafety.org, where they have the form. But
Mhm.
obviously, each county, you can do it in each county. And if the court deems that you may have a point, um, a weapon is taken away from someone who is either temporarily, uh, the law assumes temporarily a danger to themselves or others. And then that person um, uh, then has the ability to go to the court to convince them that no, I'm okay. This person's out to lunch, or I'm okay now. I was depressed or whatever. And I think there's been pretty solid research on this that indicates how many mass shootings have been avoided. Um, and their methodology I thought was pretty interesting and pretty solid. And I would argue actually that probably more lives were saved from avoiding suicides than homicides. And that wasn't even tracked by the study. Um, it's unequally used in California counties, meaning there's some counties like our county and San Diego County that use it a lot. And then there's some counties where people don't know about it and people don't use it. So it's a really great thing for journalists to talk about, for us all to talk about, because it's a way to make people safer. And I hope that the juxtaposition between mental health and gun violence is some place that has more of a potential for bipartisan cooperation.
Mhm.
Um, uh, that's been borne out a little bit, not as much as I would hope, but a little bit.
Yeah. You reminded me when you mentioned journalists. I remember you told me one time a long time ago, you wanted to be a journalist when you were young, but you found out you couldn't have an opinion. So forget
Yeah,
that.
forget that. Yeah, I guess I would have been fine being a journalist
Oh
when
no.
in the 18th century, or the early 19th, where you could just be like, or unfortunately, maybe in some places now, where you could be be totally biased and
Here's
still
your chance right now.
cover things. No, I I am of the belief that you really, you know, that good journalism is like good refing in a game, and I am I you got God help you guys, because it's a tough industry to maintain that uh, these days, because anybody with an opinion and a blog can try to call themselves a journalist. But some
Yeah.
of us know who the real ones are.
Yeah. And then we got Trump suing, journalists,
Yeah,
outlets just because of an article,
it's not like you guys make enough money to sue you anyway, and that's just like horrible, right? Like for the democracy, for the future of the democracy. There's journalists I obviously really feel like they have got an axe to grind with me, but the idea of suing them, like, that's so unappealing to me, of that what that creates in a society. It's so wrong. I can't even get into it.
Yeah, and plus, I mean, when it comes to government officials, like that's like we exist to hold them. That's like our number one job. So it's one thing if it's a private person and you're just like, you're writing stuff. That's different. But an elected official is like that's part of our fair game. You take the good with the bad. It's better to have a First Amendment that allows for all types of coverage, even if it's unfair or inaccurate, than to have no protections and have speech controlled. So we err on the side of everything as opposed to just some things. But it's amazing some super smart people can't figure that out. Let me talk to you about assembly, higher education. I know this was one of your focuses, and I know you worked bills through the assembly. So can you talk about what you did in the area of higher education? I remember trying to encourage students to transfer, incentivizing them to transfer, choices about higher education options. Talk to me about higher education and legislature and what you worked on.
Well, I loved the higher education work, because uh, you know, number one, I loved it because I care about it. I think the higher education system in the state of California is the greatest um, peaceful engine um, of opportunity and wealth equity that the world has ever known. And there's pretty solid research. I could turn you on to the book that indicates that um, been very few successful peaceful mechanisms for wealth equity, but uh, good higher education in the state of California is one of them, because it always sought to enroll a high percentage of our high school graduates, and give them quality education. And so, I did serve as chair of the higher education committee for a couple years when I was in the legislature. I loved that gig. And we did something really revolutionary in that committee is, we really tried to govern um, common sense wise, and usually the chair and the committee consultant get together and they make the recommendations for all the Democrats. Well, what I did in that committee is the chair, we also included the vice chair, who's the ranking Republican, and his committee consultants, and we tried to figure out if we could sometimes come up with bipartisan recommendations. And what that really did is it meant that interest groups had less influence over the process, and students benefited because our hope was to preserve the benefit for student success.
So walk me through this. So let me ask you a little bit of a tough question as it relates to the redevelopment agencies. As I guess it wasn't higher education. I think it was K through 12, but the governor decided, we're going to have to abolish redevelopment agencies because many entities were not using this redevelopment money in a way that they had originally intended, that the legislature had originally intended. And so what happened was this funding mechanism for redevelopment and I believe like 20% for housing also went away. And so at this time, right, here's DOS, here's not just you, but you're our representative. here's Doss, the liberal, the progressive, Jerry Brown is pushing this, the housing advocate, and we're going to take away this funding that was supposed to repair blight and create housing. And you were on board with that. So talk to me about the abolition of the redevelopment agencies, because I still hear people today talking about how that wrecked affordable housing in communities.
And I want to say, first of all, people who talk about that, they are right that it hurt the production of affordable housing. There's no question about that. And but most communities were in a very different boat than what we did. I mean, Helene and Brian and I on the city council, along with help, I believe, if my memory corrects, from Marty Bloom, really made sure we spent far more than the 20% on housing. I think some years we were spending 50% on housing. And so we did the right thing here in the city of Santa Barbara. But a lot of communities, redevelopment was much more of a slush fund for, anything. And in some cases, some real, poor decisions were made. And this whole scenario maybe is an example of how a lot of people can fight for some things that are really important and have, worse ramifications because they fought and didn't come up with a compromise. Because if you go back, what my class needed to do, and Jerry Brown, what we needed to do was to cut the state budget by a third. And if you've ever tried to cut your personal budget by a third, you know how hard this is. It is not like easy to accomplish. In fact, that the year before we did it, there was a cool project that would go up and down the state, allowing citizen meetings to try to scenario cut the state budget, and most people couldn't do it. The only people who could is my constituents down in Ventura, because they were the only people who raised taxes and cut things. But so it was very hard to find what to cut. So Brown proposed a 50% haircut for redevelopment agencies. When you think about it, if even the city of Santa Barbara, we were on our good years spending 50% on housing and 50% for other things, 50%, there's some logic to that, right? Most agencies were probably wasting about that much. The cities understandably didn't like that idea, and they sued the state and the governor, and instead of embracing any kind of compromise, and that was a real mistake. And I mean, I will say that I told one of the lead plaintiffs that's a real mistake, because one of the lead city litigants was local. It was not the city of Santa Barbara. City of Santa Barbara was playing a smart game, and I was able to help them because they were playing a smart game. But other local cities sued, and the result was the state couldn't do a 50% haircut of it. They could just eliminate it entirely. And Jerry Brown is not somebody you mess with like that, right? He just was like, okay, we're going to do the whole thing, because that's what it's going to take to make sure education has necessary funding in the middle of this budget haircut that's happening. And long run, the mechanism of redevelopment just keeps on sucking away resources from education. And back then, per pupil spending in the state of California was only $5,000 per year. It was less than 5,000, I believe, actually, but it was that was about the benchmark right afterwards. It's now a lot better, and the elimination of redevelopment is part of the reason why it's a lot better. That being said, it was a mistake not to set up anything to succeed it, particularly for affordable housing. And so this is one of the decisions, you go through there's a lot of decisions that I feel great about. Um, and then there's decisions that you go, that was a mistake. And I sure wish we did something then. And I want to do something now, right? And it's one of the reasons why I support the idea of a dedicated funding source for affordable housing.
Mhm.
Um, because, yeah, we could have used, in those years, we probably would have three more significantly sized affordable housing projects here in the city of Santa Barbara. Now, going back to playing ball smartly, what I counseled the city of Santa Barbara folks is let's figure this out. Let's negotiate with the state. And the city of Santa Barbara was able to keep most of its RDA paid for assets, which includes the parking lots. And so I am proud. I'm not a big fan of parking lots, but of, I am proud that we were able to keep the city's parking lots, because it's part of a solid strategy for downtown. And I was able to do that partially because I work hard, but partially because um, I was a yes vote for the budget, and so I was able to save RDA assets both here in Santa Barbara and in Ventura County, because I was an aye vote on the budget. So if I'd done a symbolic thing against, we would be in a worse situation now.
Yeah. It's a tough world if you're not part of it. And so it's easy to levy criticism, right? But could someone watching be saying, when Doss was in Santa Barbara, he was for Santa Barbara and he was for housing. And then when he's in the legislature, he's for Jerry Brown and he's doing redevelopment. Um, Now we know something should have been done to save funding for housing. Back then, can you take me back to your mindset? Could you have introduced a bill the next year? It was not on your mind. It's just everybody makes mistakes or you're focused on other things. Why not in the assembly come back the next year and say, hey, we got to fix this?
Well, we did. It wasn't me. It was my colleague Luis Alejo,
Okay.
that put forward a successor bill. He's now Monterey County Supervisor, so followed the same trajectory. And he was right, and that bill should have passed. So we did try to bring it back, but it didn't get over the finish line. I think it was too soon for the governor. You know, but I'm for Santa Barbara and I'm for Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown had the right thing on almost everything except for that bill. And you know, uh, I, I would have followed Jerry Brown as his disciple for as long as it takes to save the freaking world. I'll tell you that. I'd do it now.
Okay. We got about 10 minutes, so I want to go over some things. And I don't want to gloss over your our environmental record in the assembly because I know this is where you're focused right now. So I want to give you that opportunity. One thing we didn't talk about was pipelines, plugging old oil wells. We had that oil spill right in the middle of your assembly term, or right around there, the local one. So, can you talk about what you did in terms of oil and capping those wells and pipelines, just for a couple minutes?
Yeah, no, I'm real proud. After the Refugio oil spill, we passed a big tightening of pipeline safety, requiring automatic shutoff valves, and other mechanisms that were state of the art, but hadn't been mandated. And those have to go into pipelines before they can be restarted. And it's very relevant because even the pipeline fight we lost here in Santa Barbara, where they're trying to restart it. They have to put in those automatic shutoff valves, and they've had to do this throughout the state. Another bill that I'm real proud of that we made progress on, and Monique really took it by the horns and took it even farther, is in forcing more proper capping of idle oil wells.
Mhm.
Um, Oil companies sometimes will leave a well idle because the price of oil is low, or something like that, right? And they're going to come back later. Well, the price of oil has been very high for a long time, and some of these wells have been idle for 20, 30 years. So it's increasingly becoming obvious that a lot of these wells are idle because they want to avoid the cost of properly capping them and what's called abandoning them. Abandonment in this case is a good word in the industry, um, and that's a problem because idle wells can leak not only oil but even worse than that, methane, which is a very potent climate pollutant. Um, and that then brings me to the third of that, which is this biggest source of methane out there is our trash from landfills. And so the bill that requires that essentially bans organics from the landfill was a bill that we
Hmm.
had a significant part in. It's the short-lived climate pollutants bill by Ricardo Lara. And it went through my committee, and we had a big hand in it. It's been a tough one for a lot of communities who didn't invest in an anaerobic digestion system with a MRF from the beginning, as we did here in Santa Barbara County. We were ahead of the curve, but a lot of other communities are taking the route we have, both because it's the right thing to do to reduce the amount of climate pollutants that counties and landfills are creating, but also because of the state mandate that they don't have an alternative and can't put food waste and yard waste in the landfill anymore.
Yeah. No. So much, and you're doing it on a 2-year cycle, right? You're
Oh,
constantly trying to get your 1 year work campaigning, it's just
my life is fast paced, being a parent and a supervisor, but it was even more fast paced back then. I mean, some weeks were so busy, staff would do, you know, 15 or 20-minute meetings, one after another, all through the day, and then committee meetings and votes in state taking in committee and hearing bills. And, it's just like it was non-stop. I am really happy that my wife stuck with me through all that craziness, and that we were able to settle down afterwards. A legislator that is in a district like this comes back most weekends. We did, partially because you got to meet with constituents on Friday, and partially because there's so many community events, as people know, in this vibrant community and active community. Um, but it was a pace that I'm glad we haven't had to do again.
so in part three we're going to get into the board of supervisors. I promise anyone watching, but we're going to start it a little bit here. So let's talk a little bit about, we live in this era where marijuana, cannabis legalized, right? Okay, so there's all this regulation that comes with it. And so in the assembly, talk to me about sort of what your role was in sort of regulating, taxing the distribution, the sales of cannabis. And then I want to ask you about the county board before we wrap up.
Yeah, the big debate in the part of the tail end of my time in the assembly on this was how do you uh, how and when do you move from medicinal marijuana, which was always kind of loosey goosey, right? Well intentioned, there for a reason. I think compassionate use was a good thing, but also kind of loosey goosey, right? In the regulatory sense. Um, how do you move to another paradigm? And I at the time was really worried about doing it in the way that would hurt the black market the most, um, but also have controls. And I tried to get an idea that may sound crazy, but is used in other states, um, where the state where its production and distribution was a state monopoly.
Mhm.
And this is the model that Utah uses and a couple other states use on alcohol, meaning anybody who's vending alcohol in those states is a contractor to the state. And that's a really high degree of control. And I understand why some people didn't like that idea. It definitely wouldn't have made it as much of a boom industry. Um, uh, Maybe it's for some folks, it was too much government interference. But you know, I wish I would have worked harder on promoting that idea. I wish people would have embraced it. I feel like the system would have gone better with that. Um, the other big decision that happened while I was in the legislature um, was the board of supervisors that decided, we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we treat, legacy medicinal marijuana grows? Do we decide that those guys are legal or that they need to go get permits before they can grow, in which case they would have to stop growing even if they had been growing? It's a tough call. But I thought that really the biggest reason why we've had such a hard time in marijuana policy and why it's such a, you know, knife fight, is because the decision was made uh, by the board before I was there to make that medicinal marijuana growing operations are legal non-conforming, which means they can continue to grow without a permit. Um, and even though I opposed it at the time, I didn't really even then realize how bad of a situation this would create, because it created a situation where once I became a supervisor, where we needed to get regulations ASAFP, right? Because there is a big industry operating without any regulatory powers over it at all, right? Um, and so some people wonder why we moved so fast on that, and part of it is out of optimism. Yeah, we hoped that this would work out great, but part of it's also out of fear that we had an industry that we knew needed a regulatory structure that was not regulated. Um, so there are things that haunt you sometimes in this business, and I wish it would have gone differently. And you could say that in some ways it's haunted me to this very day. But uh, I mean, it was like I said uh, at the hearing that you were talking about, my last hearing on Tuesday. You don't get all of these things right. Sometimes there's not a right answer. Sometimes there's two wrong answers, and you need to figure out which one's less wrong. Um, and it's not really, it can't be when you're making hundreds of decisions, which you do per year as a supervisor, or thousands of decisions a year, which you do as a state legislator. You can't get all of them right. You just kind of have to make the world better a little bit at a time, and try to revisit some things, fix them a little bit at a time later. And we can go into that a little bit more next time.
Yeah. The cannabis, it's expensive still. Like like it's so regulated. What I hear, from people is like, you just get it on the black market still because it's less expensive. It's so expensive kind of thing for a lot of people, not for super. But I want to end on just one question.
That's important, Josh, right?
Yeah,
The it's 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 from a grower's perspective, it's really cheap. But yes, by the time the consumer gets it, there's so many taxes on it, so much regulatory burden, and maybe market power at the distributor level that it ends up being sometimes more expensive than the black market. That doesn't take away from the fact that if you don't know if the weed you buy is legal, that you are still contributing to human pain and to a bad situation. So if you do smoke, you know, I just really hope that you know where it comes from, and if and hopefully it comes from a legal dispensary, because as much as that's been a roller coaster ride for people like me and some people in my community, it's still better to have legal weed out there than to have black market stuff, which has pesticides, is tied up in the cartels in Southern California, and just has a lot of bad stuff. It's the infrastructure of human pain for the cartels. Don't buy it, please.
yeah. Last thing, Doss, this is a political question, and then we'll send it off, tease to the third part where we're going to talk about your future, hopefully, and what's coming up for you. But the cannabis thing gets all tangled in the campaign contributions. Is that a regret? It's hard I know you, right? And to win campaigns, you got to raise money. It's if you're going to play the game, you got to play it intensely. So you take money from everybody, essentially, right? Do you regret the nexus between the amount of money you took and the ordinance and people blending those two and one of the things that haunted you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely haunted me. I think, unfortunately, somewhat as a double standard because, most elected officials did that back then, and no one else has been held accountable for it. However, um, yeah, I mean, it, it, I put garters on what kind of contributions I would take. There was some garters on that, such as oil. No, I never take oil money or tobacco money, or there was some other ones I swore off. Uh, but an industry that's reducing pesticides, that's you know employing workers at a livable wage. I mean, we just talked about how tough farm workers' lives are in this county, for the last 2 months. Who's already paying well better than a living wage, better than 26 bucks an hour with benefits, marijuana. So I mean, at the time, I didn't think that this is questionable. It was also years before a decision would have to be made. But I obviously understand how some people saw it, and I am sorry that it undermined their confidence. That sucks. But I will tell you that when you're looking at you know what kind of folks are out there in the political game. Back in 2015, in 2016, they looked pretty good, you know, and obviously with how slow things improved in Carpinteria, I understand how people see that a little bit differently than I did back in 2016.
Yeah. Well, Doss Williams, I appreciate your time. You're such a success story, regardless of what people know of you, see of you, think of you. When you look at how far you've come, what you've done, growing up as the kid in IV, bouncing around, how you've turned your life around, and you've been living in public service for forever. And you are somebody who's made a huge impact, huge difference. And of course, people are always going to have their qualms. I have my qualms with you, as we've talked from a, part personal, part professional. But there's no doubt that, when you step down, is huge. No one's going to be able to replace you. Like, it's just, no one has that skill set, that mind, those experiences. So it's definitely a loss, for the county in terms of that public service area. So, notwithstanding mistakes, I think we need to look at a person's success story too. And I know a lot of people are proud of you, especially your dad, who seems to be on the Facebook constantly promoting you.
Well, when you're a rice farmer in Thailand, sometimes you have some spare time, and he definitely uses it but no, my dad's a great guy. I just wish I could get him out on the surf again. Um, I know I was kind of unlikely guy, right? But I hope this gives hope to some of the introverts out there. I was an introverted guy who had dropped out of high school and was living in in my vehicle, uh, and as a teenager, and you know, I made a difference, and I'm proud of that. I made a difference because I had people who helped me, and I appreciate that more than words can express. And whether I can be replaced, I sure hope I can. The things that we are dealing with as a society, the preserving our little experiment called representative government, and tackling climate change, I think even more so. I hope the people who love me do all they can to tackle climate change. If you do love me, try, do everything you can, because the world, 50 years from now will judge us for what we did and didn't do. And I have a high degree of faith that there are some leaders who will rise up and try to take that mantle and do something good with it. And I'm going to be there to be cheering them on.
Yeah, that's great. And I would just add to that, if they could take one thing from you, is work ethic. Because the reason you were so successful is there's a lot of people who have education, a lot of people have knowledge, experiences, but no one worked harder doing things in the trenches as the elected as you did. I mean, you kept the staff work, you were the staffer working for yourself as an elected. And I think that's what people miss about you. Whether they have an opinion about you, I don't think anyone can ever criticize you with a straight face about how hard you work to put yourself in a position to be successful. And that's the missing X factor that I think a lot of people don't have, was you were doing the work yourself. So, and we'll talk about the last election next time, and your future climate change, save the world again in a different way, I guess.
Thanks, Josh.
All right,
All
Doss.
right, man.
Take care. Bye.
Yeah. Happy holidays.
You too.